EveningStory.
What are your biggest instances of paranoia? Share stories. I've always been a bit of a worrier, but it wasn't until last year that my anxiety really started to spiral out of control. I became convinced that everyone was out to get me, that my friends and even my family were secretly plotting against me. It started small, with me noticing little things that didn't quite add up. My sister would pause a beat too long before answering a question, or my coworker would give me a strange look when I walked into the break room. But before long, my mind had blown these tiny inconsistencies into a full-blown conspiracy, started to withdraw from everyone around me, convinced that anyone who got too close would only be using me for their own gain. I stopped answering phone calls, stopped responding to texts, and even started to avoid going outside altogether. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. It wasn't until I started seeing a therapist that things started to improve with her help. I learned to recognize when my thoughts were spiraling out of control, and how to challenge them with logic and reason. It's still a struggle, but I'm slowly starting to regain my trust in the people around me. Paranoia is a powerful thing, and it can take over your life before you even realize what's happening. But with the right help and support, it's possible to overcome it and learn to trust again.
It all started when I began to notice that things were not quite right. Little things at first, like the feeling that someone was watching me or the sensation of being followed. But as time went on, the paranoia grew stronger and more intense. I began to double-check every lock on my doors and windows, convinced that someone was going to break in. I started to avoid going outside and would only leave my house when absolutely necessary. Every time I heard a noise, my heart would race and I would freeze, waiting for the worst. My friends and family tried to reassure me that nothing was wrong, that it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started to notice patterns in people's behavior, small details that didn't add up. I became convinced that everyone was out to get me. One day, I went to a coffee shop to try to distract myself from my paranoid thoughts. As I was sitting there, I noticed a man at a nearby table staring at me. He wasn't doing anything threatening, just staring. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I quickly gathered my things and left the coffee shop. But as I was walking home, I noticed the man following me. My heart pounding, I picked up my pace, convinced that I was about to be attacked. When I finally made it home safely, I realized that the man had simply been going in the same direction as me and was not following me at all. It was then that I realized the true extent of my paranoia and sought help from a mental health professional.
I started feeling like everyone was out to get me. I became hyper-vigilant, always looking over my shoulder and second-guessing everyone's intentions. I would spend hours researching conspiracy theories and alternate explanations for everything that happened to me. One day, I received a package in the mail from an anonymous sender. Inside was a note that read, "We're watching you." I was convinced that someone was after me and that I was in danger. I changed my routine, took different routes to work, and avoided going out at night. I even went as far as installing security cameras in my apartment to keep an eye on things. But the paranoia didn't stop. It wasn't until I confided in a friend about my fears that I realized how irrational my thoughts had become. With their help, I sought therapy and slowly worked through my fears.
I once knew a guy who was always on edge. He was convinced that someone was following him, watching him, and trying to hurt him. It didn't matter where he went or what he did. He was always looking over his shoulder and checking for signs of danger. One day, he came to me with a wild story about how he had been followed home from the grocery store by a van with tinted windows. He was convinced that the people in the van were out to get him and that they had been tracking his every move. I tried to reason with him, telling him that it was probably just a coincidence, but he wouldn't listen. He went on and on about how he had seen the same van parked outside his apartment building and how the people inside were watching him through the windows. Things got worse from there. He started carrying a weapon with him everywhere he went and refused to leave his apartment without checking for signs of danger first. He even stopped answering his phone because he was convinced that the people following him were listening in on his conversations. Eventually, It got to the point where he was completely isolated and alone. His paranoia had taken over his life, and he couldn't see that there was no one out to get him. It was a sad and lonely existence, but he couldn't seem to break free from his delusions.
I've always considered myself a pretty rational person, but after what happened last month, I'm not so sure anymore. It all started with a strange package that showed up on my doorstep. It was just a plain brown box with no return address, but there was something unsettling about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was some sort of trap, or that it contained something dangerous. Despite my better judgment, I opened the box. Inside was a small object that I couldn't quite make out at first. As I picked it up, I realized it was a miniature camera, complete with a tiny lens and micro SD card. My heart raced as I wondered who could have sent it and why. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. I started noticing the same cars following me on my commute to work, and I swear I saw the same faces in every crowd. I even started to suspect my coworkers of spying on me. As the paranoia took hold, I began to take drastic measures to protect myself. I installed security cameras around my home and workplace, and I started carrying a knife with me everywhere I went. I even took self-defense classes and started training in martial arts. But the worst was yet to come. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone rummaging through my belongings. I jumped out of bed and confronted the intruder, ready to defend myself. But as soon as I saw their face, my heart sank. It was my best friend, holding the same type of camera that had arrived in the mysterious package. As it turned out, my friend had sent the camera as a practical joke, but it had backfired spectacularly. The paranoia had taken over, and I had become a shadow of my former self. It was a wake-up call for me, and I realized that my paranoia had gotten out of control. I sought help and eventually overcame my fears, but I'll never forget the terror that consumed me during that time.
I've always been a bit of a paranoid person, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened last summer. It started with the strange noise outside my window one night. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just an animal or something. But then it happened again the next night, and the next. I became obsessed with figuring out what was making the noise. One night, I decided to stay up and keep watch. As I peered through the blinds, I saw something moving in the shadows. My heart racing, quietly slipped out of my apartment and followed the figure. It led me to an old abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. I watched from a distance as the figure disappeared inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on in that warehouse. So, I started doing some research. I found out that it used to be a research facility that was shut down years ago due to a contamination scare. The rumors were that there was still something inside that the government didn't want anyone to know about. My paranoia kicked into overdrive. I started to see suspicious people everywhere I went. I was convinced that they were following me, watching my every move. I even thought that my own friends and family were in on the conspiracy. One day, I decided to confront the mystery head-on. I snuck into the warehouse, my heart pounding in my chest. As I crept through the dark corridors, I heard voices up ahead. I froze in terror, but then I heard something that made me even more afraid. "They're onto us. We need to move the samples." I knew then that my paranoia was justified. I had stumbled upon something big, something dangerous. I quickly left the warehouse and went straight to the authorities. It turns out that the government had indeed been using the abandoned warehouse to store hazardous materials. They had been keeping it a secret to avoid causing a panic. Thanks to my paranoia, they were finally caught and the materials were safely disposed of. The experience left me shaken, but it also made me realize that sometimes paranoia can be a good thing. You never know what you might uncover if you're always on the lookout for suspicious activity.
It was a dark and stormy night, and I was home alone. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a noise downstairs. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the wind. But my mind started racing. What if it was an intruder? What if they were going to hurt me? I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my heart racing with fear. The operator picked up and I started babbling about an intruder in my house. They told me to stay on the line and not to hang up until the police arrived. As I waited for what felt like an eternity, I heard more noises coming from downstairs. My imagination started running wild and I was convinced that someone was going to break into my room any moment. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and held it tightly, ready to defend myself. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens outside. The police had arrived. I ran downstairs to let them in, my heart still pounding with fear. They searched the house and found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no one hiding in the shadows. It was just my imagination. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of paranoia. I started locking every door and window in the house, checking and double-checking them every night. I couldn't sleep properly, always on edge, waiting for someone to break in. It wasn't until I sought professional help that I was able to overcome my paranoia and start feeling safe again.